Hello and welcome to Grieving for a Complicated Person, part of the Good Grief Festival. I'm Liesl Dawson, Associate Professor at the University of Bristol, and I'm delighted to introduce Blake Morrison. Blake is a poet, author, and regular literary arts critic for The Guardian and the London Review of Books. He is also the author of 3 memoirs. And When Did You Last See Your Father? A book that helped kickstart a new form of memoir, which tells the story of an ordinary life, which is often, in fact, extraordinary. Things My Mother Never Told Me, which is about his mum, and his most recent book, Two Sisters, about his sister Gill and his half-sister Josie. Before we start, I just want to remind you about the practicalities. This panel is being recorded and will be available afterward on our YouTube channel, the Grief channel. And there's also some time for questions at the end. So please do type questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free also to talk on the chat. It's always lovely to see you with your reflections and your thoughts, and also feel free to respond to one another's questions. So welcome, Blake. It's so wonderful to get to speak to you today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can I start by asking you about your sisters, Gill and Josie? Can you share a little bit about them and your relationship with them?
Okay, yeah. So Gill was born 16 months after me, which I think is very close. I mean, there's this phenomenon where children are born close together where they call them Irish twins. My mother was Irish, and in fact, 2 of her siblings were born just 10 months apart. I think the fact we were born so close together meant we had a very shared childhood. We did things together. If we weren't dressed completely alike, there were moments where we wore the same things. And everything seemed a joint enterprise, I suppose, in some ways, until the 11 plus, that horrible old exam where things changed. And 2 years before that, she and I were taken one evening to a local hospital where my mother had just delivered a baby, and the baby was held up to us. It never happened before, never happened again. And this baby was called Josie. And she was supposedly the child of some friends of my parents, Sam and Beatty. And it seemed weird that this should happen to us. And over the next years, even before I knew about sex, I did notice my father doting on this child. And then when I did know about sex, my suspicions that somehow she might be a half-sister, they grew. In the book about my dad that you mentioned, there are a couple of bits where I try to ask first him and then Beatty, could she be my half-sister? And they both sort of fobbed me off. But 10 years after the book came out, she rang me up one day. I changed her name, I changed her parents' names, I changed identifying details. But she said, that's me, isn't it? That's supposed to be me, the character you call Josie. I've always thought your dad was my dad, she said. And we did a DNA test, and it established that we were half siblings. So that's the book. Those are the 2 sisters, and both dead, and both dead before their time, both younger than me, and why they died and my feelings about them, and my grief as well, is all kind of woven into the book.
And the title, on the surface, you would think it's about Gill and Josie, but it also is about Gill having kind of 2 selves. And a lot of the book is about her unhappiness and her alcoholism, and the way she was, in a sense, 2 different people, depending on where she was in the drink. And some of the book, I think, is about trying to work out the origins of her unhappiness and drinking.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to know why it is you think that in death, there is this need in us often to go back over someone's life, to unpick that relationship, to sort of think through it again. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also complicated to answer, really. I mean, as far as if we take unhappiness and alcoholism separately, we had this shared childhood, and yet I seemed a much happier child. I could look back and think it was a happy childhood. Jill was more ambivalent. I think the fact that she failed her 11 plus a year after me and went off to boarding school and I was allowed to stay at home was a horrible, divisive thing. She was ejected. She felt rejected. And I think a lot of her unhappiness and lack of self-esteem went back to that. As far as the alcoholism goes, well, you know, there are some people who say, well, it just happens, you know, you get addicted. And I guess I thought there are reasons here. There are origins for the addiction and so on. And it wasn't anything that she was able to talk about ever. You know, once she dried out, once she was sober, she didn't want to acknowledge this bad stuff had happened, that she behaved badly, that she'd neglected her kids, that she'd neglected her husband and, you know, had gone off on one. She just didn't want to talk about it. And I guess we made efforts. I did, my parents did, to talk to her, and she didn't really want to talk about it. And I guess part of the book was trying belatedly to talk about it and address it and work things out. So after someone's died, you've got this new space, I suppose. They're not alive to interact with, but you're still interacting with them. And yeah, you're on a new sort of quest to work things out. And you're full of guilt as well. Of course, you're guilt. They died. Why didn't you stop them dying? Particularly since my two sisters died self-destructively, I had a lot of guilt. So all those different things are going on in the book, I guess, trying to work things out. Yeah, I think it's a sort of a journey of discovery, and I think after death and when you're in grief, you know, that you just can't help but embark on that journey.
Yeah, I felt myself reading it that I could see all the different ways that she was getting more and more unhappy and kind of unable to talk, and that things would happen, but kind of a mess. It feels like watching a car crash in slow motion, where you can see it's going to happen, but somehow you can't stop it. And there's a moment when she's caught shoplifting, and you as a sort of young person actually said, maybe she should see a therapist, maybe she should talk to someone. And, you know, that just gets completely shut down. But it did seem a family that, you know, it's interesting that you are the talker and you are the person who's investigating and delving into the past, because it's the sense was in the family was that your father had a very strong narrative of what things meant and what was happening. And actually, if the reality didn't fit with that, his reality was the one you had to kind of stick by.
Yeah, I guess he was the tyrant, you know, he was the old-fashioned patriarch. But to be fair to him and my mum, they were well aware of Jill. She was living next door to them, and they were well aware of a drink problem, which probably began when she was in her mid-30s, shortly after the birth of her two children. And at one point, they persuaded her to go into rehab. And the problem about that was, you know, she wouldn't talk even when she was there for 2 weeks. The whole thing of therapy, she was just so anti that idea that by talking you might solve issues. And then at a much later point, when my parents were dead, a friend called and said, Jill's in a real mess. She wants to go into rehab. And I set it all up. And she went to this place. And next morning, I called her husband, who hadn't been around, to say, you're probably wondering where Jill is. He said, no, she's here. She's sitting in the garden. She's sitting on the grass outside. She'd got herself out of rehab, where she'd been admitted in the evening, in the middle of the night. She had serious eyesight problems by then, but she walked down a long drive managed to hitch a lift back to the house. And she was incredibly resourceful at, well, at getting drink for one thing, but also of getting out of one kind of mess or another.
Well,
So
and there's a sense
on some level,
too.
I never thought she'd die because she'd
Yeah.
had so many narrow scrapes.
Well, and there's a sense too, there's a limit to how much we can impact someone, you know, and you see the attempts and everybody doing things in love, but it doesn't mean you're gonna, you know, save someone or change their course. There's a passage in the book that for me felt really meaningful. It's near the end. And it's when your wife, Kathy's saying to you, you're too much stuck in the past. All you do is talk about the past. You're writing these memoirs. Why are you doing this? And you write, the point about revisiting the past is that you find new things each time you go there, things you missed or didn't understand or failed to see the significance of, which as you get older, you begin to grasp. If I'm addicted to the past, well, it's because it hasn't passed. I'm still there, still working things out. And I thought, actually, there's a real difference between going back to the past in a way that just repeats a terrible event, but going back to the past as a potential source of meaning, where you keep reinvestigating it and finding new things and rethinking it.
Yeah, you know, there's the sort of creative writing adage, you know, write about what you know. But I kind of write about what I want to know, what I feel I don't know, but I need to know or need to have a better understanding of. And yeah, and you do, and things change. I mean, a lot of people felt in the memoir of my dad, although it was a book about grief and loss, that it's also quite a lot of comedy in it. And a lot of people found him a really charismatic figure. Less so in the next memoir about my mum, where he appears to be much more, well, if not tyrannical, certainly domineering. And even less charismatic, I think, in this book. And this is because, you know, I'm working things out about him. Time has passed, new ideas come into your head, new avenues for exploring stuff that is your family, it's your life, and it's their lives, but things change, you change, and you get older, and you do understand a bit more, but you're still searching.
Absolutely. One thing that's really interesting, and it's the sort of title of this talk, is about grieving someone with whom you've had a complicated relationship. And, you know, we often say grief equals love or means love, but the feelings we have toward our family and those who've died often are much more complicated. You know, they're love and hate and resentment and all the rest of it. And those feelings don't go away just because someone's died. And I just wonder if you can reflect a little bit. And I think your books are really good at sort of showing the complexity of emotion and the fact you can love and hate and feel resentment and all the rest. But I just wonder how you think that cocktail of emotions impacts the grieving process.
Yeah. I guess, and this is something we might address later, that I grieved for my mum, my dad, Gillian, in different ways. A sibling, I mean, most memoirs seem to be vertical things, you know, a child writing about the loss of a parent. A sibling is a different thing. You know, you've spent most of your life with them. You know, they're the person in your life you've known longest. It's a different kind of dynamic. The thing, I suppose, some of the guilt that I felt amidst the grief for Gill was to do with, you know, how much I loved her. Well, I think I loved her, but did I tell her often enough that I loved her? You know, was it any kind of demonstrative love? Did she feel loved? You know, could I have done better? There's all that involved there. But also, how well did I behave when dealing with her alcoholism? Because there were times when I felt pretty angry with her. When my parents had retired and, you know, could have done with some peace and rest in their lives. they were dealing with, her living next door and being, in a bad state a lot of the time, and worrying about her, and worrying about her children. And I guess I was angry and not sufficiently understanding perhaps of how alcoholism works and what it can do. So it was a complicated relationship with her. It wasn't the love I felt for my parents. It wasn't as simple as that. And so it's a much more tangled book, where I felt I had to go and think about the brother-sister relationship in general, as well as my particular relationship with her, and how well I had done for my part in being a brother to her.
Yeah, and I guess we talked last night in the David Kessler event about how, alcoholism, and you mentioned it too, is considered now a disease. It's something that takes hold of people. It's not something within their control. And yet I think there's a sense in which we don't often see it that way. And that's why friends and family feel responsible in a way that people don't if you have cancer, and in some ways trying to think about alcoholism as a disease also potentially is helpful for all the people who love them and who are trying their best, but who then feel guilt after they die.
Yeah, and because there are times when your patience runs out, you're exasperated, where you see it as a failure of will. Surely you could stop drinking if you understood how much damage you're doing. But as you say, it's a disease too, and the book wrestles with both those ideas about
thinking through it. Yes, and we've had some people in the chat sort of sharing their stories about a son who overdosed and feels the self-blame, which is really easy to understand how people feel like this, but you do want to say, it's not your fault really. And also people with family members who have really complicated relationships. You said a little bit about the difference in how you grieved for your dad and your mom and your sister. Do you feel like you've sort of said all you want to say about that, or are there any other insights about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I would say is the biggest grief, which had me going to a counsellor, therapist afterwards, was for my father, because I wasn't prepared. Yeah, a friend had died in a car accident when I was a teenager, but really, and my grandmother had died, but really I hadn't close acquaintance with death, if you like, and was unprepared for my father's death, and I was in huge grief and hole. I could not have talked about him in the year after his death without my eyes watering, and I did have some sessions with a therapist. The trouble with those was that I don't think I was really unburdening myself properly or talking to her as candidly and honest as I should have. And I had this sort of my dad looking over my shoulder saying, "You're not wasting good money on a therapist, are you?" And in a way, well, I wouldn't say it was right, but the therapy for me was writing the book. By writing, I was able to deal with all these emotions and confront them and articulate them and be able to talk about him afterwards, calmly, without kind of welling up. There's that Dylan Thomas line, after the first death, there is no other. And there's a little bit in me that thinks that accounts for the different types of grief. My mother died 5.5 years after my father. She was quite ill, and we were much more prepared for her death. And although I felt closer to her than to my father, in some ways the grief wasn't such an overwhelming process as the first time. And then, as perhaps we've talked already about Gill, that was a different kind of grief. She had her own family. She had people who spent more time with her than I did. So that made it different. But we were siblings, and so it was still an intense kind of grief.
You talked about how the writing was itself a kind of form of therapy. And I know you've written, I keep diaries only when I'm upset or miserable. So you have diaries, and then you have the memoirs, and the memoirs cite the diaries. They sometimes, quote chunks of them. So they're drawing on them, they're using them, but they're not the same as the diaries. And I'm interested to kind of get a sense of what it is about writing that you find therapeutic or comforting or whatever it is. And also if the diaries and the memoir writing function in the same way or a bit different.
Well, I think the diaries are, for me anyway, they're instantaneous. They are an immediate response to stuff that's just happened that I'm upset by, or worse, traumatized by, and they're raw. And the stuff in them, I would, if it weren't there, if I hadn't set it down on paper at the time, I wouldn't be able to recall it in that kind of detail, or barely at all, years later. So I'm glad that I did so, but I can't imagine a whole book consisting of just the diary entries. I'm not a great diarist, but I have that need to set things down. So for me, the therapy is like a double process. There's the immediacy of writing things down that helps me cope. Probably does make me feel a bit better. But then there's the further kind of therapy of articulating something bigger, having a wider view than you do in the immediate aftermath of something, and articulating it and giving it a shape. I think that giving a shape and structure to these feelings is what is the really therapeutic thing, and that comes in the memoir rather than in the diaries.
That's really interesting. So it's almost as if the diaries are more spontaneous and kind of getting it all out.
Yeah.
And the memoirs involve much more a critical part of your brain, evaluating, moving, shaping. David Kessler said last night, when people were talking about meaning making in relation to grief, that you don't find meaning, you excavate the pain, and the meaning is underneath. And there's something about the way that description of doing something quite active and deliberate, cutting away, which sounds a little bit like the crafting of the memoir, that you have the pain as the material, but you're actually not just releasing it, you're actually thinking through it, moving it, etc. Does that
yeah but you're also giving it to the public, or giving it to an audience, however small an audience, and so you're conscious not just of writing it down for yourself, but of having to give it a shape that makes sense to other people, that other people will be able to connect with. I mean, I was overwhelmed when the book about my dad came out 30 years ago by the number of letters and emails, the response I got. I'd never expected that. But I think that wasn't just the intimacy of the book, it was also that I was kind of articulating in a way that other people could connect with, so that their experiences, however different from mine, nonetheless, there was some overlap between what I'd been going through and what they might be going through, their kind of grieving, connecting with mine, even though they might not be identical.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And also, I mean, you discuss, I mean, this is the first book, but you discuss in a lot of detail the death process as well, in ways that you don't always get in books of that kind, in a lot of intimacy and detail. And also you're very honest about your feelings, as the last days sort of draw on and seem to never end. You're kind of like, just die, it's really painful to watch this, but like the kind of impermissible things to say, you articulate. And I think that they're usually the things that people feel but don't share.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And for instance, you might suddenly, around a deathbed, there's some humor or something, and you think, this is terrible, I can't, in this context there can't be any jokes, but sometimes there are. And yeah, I think people were quite shocked by the openness with which I described my father's last weeks and his death and his and I felt in an odd way I had his permission, because he'd taken me to see my grandfather lying in an open coffin when I was eight years old, and said, "There you are. That's what death looks like, isn't it? It's a peaceful thing, isn't it?" Well, I'm not sure I recommend anybody doing that to a small child. I don't think it was therapeutic for me, but I did feel he would understand that impulse to be open and straightforward about death and what it looks like and what it is. And so the quite a lot about that in the book, as well as the aftermath of grief. There's the actual what it looked like, what it felt like at the time.
And your desire to have his pacemaker, I found really interesting. Just because I think there is this urge to have something material, tactile, that has been part of someone you love and have been close to. But again, the pacemaker, because it's, next to the heart as well, but there's something sort of both odd, tender and comic about it.
Well, I suppose it was comic, me having to ask the undertaker, who said, "We'll have to take this out in case it explodes during cremation or something," and me saying, "Could I have that, please?" He probably thought, "What a weirdo." But yeah, this is a thing that had been inside my father's body, and perhaps also because he was a doctor, my parents were both GPs, that something appropriate about that too. But yeah, I still have it. It's on my desk.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Other people are just commenting in the chat about their own feelings of trauma of seeing an open casket, and having to see this person's mum's dead body. So that resonates with others.
Yeah, I mean, I felt immensely, well, I don't know whether honored is the right word, but I was there when both my parents died. I was in the room with each of them, and each, in the case of my mum, I'd had to shoot up from London, and my sister'd been sitting with her and went home, and within a few minutes my mother died of me arriving. And just to be there at that moment where life ceases, I didn't have that opportunity with my sister, but whether that's traumatic, but it's certainly an intensity and intimacy about it that, is probably contributes to the grieving process, probably also to the healing process.
Yes. And some say also,
you didn't miss it, you were there.
And also, I think knowing that someone's dead in a funny sort of way, like I think sometimes when things are very medicalized and when people don't have any access to the person who's dying and it's closed casket, it's hard to believe the person's gone. And I think there's that uncanniness of not really being able to take that in.
Yeah. I mean, they may have gone, but you still talk to them, don't you?
Yeah.
At some level, you carry on conversations with them. You're aware of what they would think about X or Y that you're doing. And so that, there's a weird sort of life in death phenomenon that continues.
Absolutely. And which brings me on actually to your collection of poems in some ways. So you've written Two Sisters, which is the book here, but at the same time, or sort of after this, you also produced a collection of 21 poems called Skin and Blister, mostly about Gill, your sister, which in some ways do carry on a kind of conversation with her. And I wonder if you could sort of say a little bit about the collection and maybe read for us the first poem, Sister Sestina. And Katrine, would you be able to pull that up for us as well?
Yeah, I mean, 2 years after I'd finished, or 2 years after my sister died, Gill, after I had more or less drafted the memoir Two Sisters, I still had more to say, and I think I wanted a conversation with her and to address her directly. In this poem, Sister Sestina, you'll see the Sestina form requires you to keep using 6 words, the key words that come at the end of each line, and you have to use them in a different place in each stanza. So it's quite a complicated form, but I did find, it did, and the sonnets that I also wrote, the other 20 poems, allowed me to talk to her in ways I hadn't been able to in the memoir. I think that's the way I'd put it. Sister Sestina. Death dropped its guillotine on my sister. She wouldn't have seen it coming. She's blind, was blind. I haven't got used to the tense. I confuse those still living with those past. What gets me through the evenings is drink. Ironic that, since drink is what killed her. I'm guessing it's unlikely you met her. We were close, I think, though I've no other sister to compare. Small, curly-haired, fond of a drink, she was, by the end, officially blind. A woman so bright that nothing got past her, could see only when the light was intense, which made every excursion a tense affair, for others as well as for her, her hand clutching your arm as you steered her past banana skins and cracks. But my sister was tough, didn't whinge about being blind, was cheery and stoical until drink took over, when all she'd want was more drink, cheap wine mostly, not just to feel less tense, but to black out the knowledge she was blind, then fall asleep till nothing could stir her. There she'd be, out like a light, my poor kid sister, immune to her children, though she loved them past words, overwhelmed by a habit passed down through the genes. I too like a drink, you see, with that in common, my sister and me, a weakness for booze. I make no pretense about it. In a way, I'm weaker than her, since I've no excuse. It's not like I'm blind and needing solace, whereas she went half blind when her kids were small. All that's in the past, and if ever I get angry and blame her for deserting us, I tell myself that drink gave her no choice. The need grew too intense, and night dropped its guillotine on my sister. Because of drink, she's in the wrong tense. I had a sister who was stoic and blind. Now she's passed, and I write poems for her.
I think that's beautiful. And it's so interesting to hear that after having read the various books, because you can hear parts of them sort of coming through. And I think the Sestina, which has the repeating words, seems quite a good form for grief. You know, that grief has this repetitive quality of going back over the past over and over, but here the words keep re-emerging in slightly different ways.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right. And it's a really complicated form. And so the weird, almost, it feels rather unforgivable thing was that I seemed to write it quite quickly. And maybe that was because I was circling around grief or the search for understanding of Gill and what went wrong. But yes.
Well, and I think they're really beautiful. And the sonnets themselves, it makes me think a little bit about Elizabeth Bishop, because she writes the Sestina, which is a kind of grieving poem as well, where it's about, it feels to me also about the return of memories that come back and resurface, but aren't quite the same each time they return.
Yeah, and you've got this tight verse form that you're working within the constraints, and that, if you like, contains strong emotion. But the other thing I felt that the poems were doing that 2 years after her death, I hadn't managed to do in the meantime in the memoir, was to talk to her and also for her to say a few things to me. So there are little bits of italics in the poems where she's speaking to me, breaking in sometimes impatiently, and saying in the last poem, you know, enough, you can't keep writing my obituary, you know.
Yeah, I want to read that because that was a poem that was really powerful for me. And I'm going to read the whole thing. 2 years to the day, I'm sitting in the spot where the news came through, under skies you'd kill for, primed to go, pen, notebook, cafetiere, but failing to compose a final sonnet. Not because there's nothing more to say, or I feel stupid talking to a ghost and want to lay our sibling history to rest, but because you've had enough. And then this is her voice in the italics. Call it a day, Blake, please. You're sealing me like a fly in amber, holding me to the past when I want to get on with oblivion. You can't keep writing my obituary. Slipping off behind a cloud, the sun just went out, and the sonnet I've not written is complete. And I love the way there she breaks into the poem, her voice breaks through in sort of irritation, frustration, but also this sense that your poem, you're trying to keep her like a fly in amber, alive, fixed, something you can hold on to. And you associate the oblivion of death with the oblivion of drink, this kind of lovely form of non-being that actually can be comforting as well as terrifying.
Yeah, and of course the thing about trying to keep someone alive, it seems to me that the memoir, particularly the one about my dad, was at some level I was refusing to accept that he was dead, and I created a book in which he was very much alive. I was finding him at his most alive, and that was, at some level, I suppose there was denial in it. I was keeping him alive even though he'd gone, and maybe that impulse lies behind a lot of memoirs.
Yeah.
So many memoirs, after all, are not only full of grief, but they're addressed to a partner or a parent, and the traumatized author is keeping them there.
Well, and I think often after a death, one's left with those death moments which stick with you, and sometimes they block out the other memories, the memories of somebody not dead, not dying, not sickly. And I think in that book, what's interesting is the structure, which moves back and forth between your childhood and him dying in hospital. And it's almost as if you're trying to reconcile those two modes of his being and pull them together as the same person, because they feel like such different people in a way that's, strange.
I could imagine him complaining about that book, that I'd spent too much time on his last weeks, when he was ill. Could I just have a bit more of the earlier stuff? But there was plenty of that when he was fully alive as well.
There's also a poem where you say, and this is 19, just forget for a minute that you're dead. It's not so hard. I do it all the time. Shake off your dust, stitch up your bones, and climb to the top of Embassy Moor. And you talk about this kind of climb you did as children, and the kind of foreshadows what's to come. But I was interested in that as well. I mentioned to you before that there was a question last night for David Kessler. Is it okay to occasionally almost pretend the dead person isn't dead and has gone on vacation? And I wondered about art and creativity as a space where we, dabble with this idea of the dead coming back to us or being with us.
Yeah, I mean, it's, art should allow for magical thinking. And, it is magical thinking to, when someone is dead, to still be talking to them as if they were alive. But, my God, of course you can do that. Of course you should be allowed to, if you like, pretend, or there is still stuff to discuss. There's, it's particularly in relation to my dad, there are all sorts of things that have happened since his death that I think I want to tell him about and share with him, and he'd be really interested in, mobile phones, Dad. You'd have loved mobile phones, and or to take a silly example. But that's going on in our heads, and so why shouldn't it also be on the page or in a painting or in some art form too?
Yeah, no, that's lovely. We do have some questions. While I open them up and look at them, a final question for you is about what you've learned about siblings. So for those who've not read Two Sisters, as well as the story of your relationship with your sisters, we also get accounts of brothers and sisters over time. And from the most sort of strange and incestuous and overly entwined to quite destructive, nasty brothers and sisters, the kind of whole range of sibling relationships. But also your sense that actually brothers and sister relationships haven't been that represented in literature.
No.
And I just wonder what your kind of overall insights or thoughts are about siblings, given this work.
Well, in the aftermath of Gill's death, it's always been my habit to turn to books, to turn to literature for insights, for solace, and so on. And there seemed a lack of what I call siblit, the literature of siblings, and particularly brothers writing about sisters. Sisters writing about sisters, brothers writing about brothers, and so on. Fine, but brothers writing about sisters. And obviously, I think there's some patriarchy involved there, some history of where brothers didn't think sisters were of account enough to be written about, important enough. And if you look at the relationships as recorded in history or in novels or in memoirs, very often the sister is, if involved with a brother, is like a helpmeet. He's like, like doing all the drudgery. And or if they are an equal creative partner, or say Dorothy Wordsworth or Fanny Mendelssohn, whoever, they don't get the credit the brother got.
There's something slightly exploitative about many of those relationships where, the sister's very dependent on the brother.
Yes.
And yet the brother's very much using a lot of the work of the sister.
Yeah. And so, and I couldn't help think about all that, because I did feel that probably growing up in the 50s and 60s that I was given primacy. I was given priority as a brother. I was the more important of the two of us, which is a terrible thing to say, but I think that was there in the whole culture, that boys had priority. And so, no wonder I'd look to examples in literature and history of something similar going on. And as you say, quite often brothers behaving maliciously towards sisters, or wanting to marry them off to somebody there where the brother would benefit, or punishing them for what they would consider an illicit liaison, and so on. Quite sort of, bad behavior, frankly.
Yeah. No, indeed. Okay, so let me turn now to some of the questions that we've had from our audience. So first one, my late mum suffered from depression and alcoholism, and I'm not sure I ever knew a truly happy version of her. Since she died 5 years ago, I've put up photos of her from before I was born. Do you think I'm being disingenuous by remembering a version of her I never met?
No, I don't think you're being disingenuous. You've got, if you like, an unhappy relationship to look back on, or an unhappy mum to look back on, and you want to find something else. I mean, I think I had a similar thing going on with Gill, that I had just this, I carried with me to her death this image of her being unhappy. And actually, by looking back and talking to one or two people, including our kids and others, I realized there was a lot more happiness in Gill's life. I wasn't party to it. I couldn't share it, but she wasn't this just sad and tragic figure completely, and I'd not seen that. And so I think putting out photos or trying to see that there was something else is a completely natural process, and maybe actually, an access to the truth.
That's lovely. And, Julia Samuel, I can't remember which case study it is, but in her book, Grief Works, she talks about one of her clients whose mum died when he was very little and sort of carried that grief with him. And part of what they did was to imagine a mum who loved him. So kind of almost give him back a sense of his mother loving him, being there, being present. And I mean, in that case, it was very much using his imagination, but I think it gave him great comfort to go through that process.
Yeah.
And so I think people are complicated. So the sort of having the happy pictures, we all have our ways of thinking, but actually other pictures might give us a more complicated version of the person who existed.
And a truer version.
Yeah. We have another question from Carol. My older brother said we were like twins, 9 years apart. There's perhaps Italian twins. Oh, since his suicide, I felt a double emptiness of the loss of him and of myself. Is there a way to merge these losses and find a more simple grieving process? So what I almost want to ask there is that the loss of him and loss of myself, as in your sense of self for being his brother, his sister, I think, possibly. Like, what are your thoughts?
That sort of sense of twinship, and kinship. That if you've been close, whatever the age gap, then the grief is going to be greater, isn't it? Go deeper, and you'll feel like you've died too, at some level. I mean, I'm not enough of a grief counselor to know what could help there.
I think too, this was sort of mentioned last night, but when we lose someone we love, part of what we lose is the way that they hold a version of our. They look at us with a vision of who we are. And sometimes when we lose that person, we lose that version of ourselves that makes us feel, sort of gives us back, And I wonder too if there are other people in her life who can help give her back some sense of who she is, and also maybe let her talk about her brother. And sort of bring him into conversations and make him present to them and for her. I mean, that capacity to talk about people when they're gone, and having that opportunity, because not everybody will have known both of you, but make the most of those opportunities if they're there. We've had a question from Kathy. Did you experience disenfranchised grief with your sister's death? People feeling that you have no right to grieve in instances where people choose to die. So like the sense that, well, it can be disenfranchised grief because often grief for a sister is not recognized, or because she was an alcoholic, or I guess in the case of Josie, the fact that people didn't know you were a half brother.
No, I mean, we haven't talked much about Josie, but her husband and my family knew about the halfness, but not many other people did, or do. In the case of Gill, I know it's a good question, because of course she had her kids, her 2 children grown up, and she had her ex-husband, who was nonetheless still at some level a husband, still looking after her, still living close to her, was sharing the house when she died. And I felt, well, their grief takes priority over mine. They were the ones who lived with her and saw much more of her and spent more of their adult life, or her adult life, and I was at a distance and had my own family. I was elsewhere, and what right do I have for grief? But it's there, it's and to be fair to them, they included me. There was a moment at the funeral where you all sat at the front. We all kind of touched the coffin afterwards. I felt I was being given equal rights, if you like. But it's a good question, because some people will feel excluded, as if they don't count, however strong their feelings might be.
We have another question from Ross. In terms of the 2 genres, memoir and poetry, how do they differ? We've talked about this a little bit, but how do they differ in terms of the process, the crafting, and in terms of the central questions that they raise and the way a reader might relate to them? I mean, to me, they both need to be crafted. I think with the poems, the particular little pamphlet that we talked about, Skin and Blister, I'm working very regular verse forms, sestina and sonnet, which I don't normally do. And
that the need to work within that form is both a constraint and an inspiration that you don't have that in the same way in a memoir, but you still have to find the appropriate structure. You talked about the alternating in When Did You Last See Your Father? And in this book, I have these digressions where I talk about other brothers and sisters down in history, which to me aren't really digressions. They are all part of my search for understanding, putting myself in a wider context. The odd thing is that and When Did You Last See Your Father came out, I'd written 2 books of poems, and I think the memoir was far more intimate, far more emotional, far more open than the poems had ever been. People think poetry is bearing your soul, but actually I seem to bear my soul more in memoir. It's going to be different for everybody. All I'd say is, yeah, they're both demanding of craft and equally, I'd say. Equally so.
You're doing great. We're getting through lots of questions, which is lovely. We have a question from Debbie. Society's not always equipped to let us talk about death in general, but when a death is complicated because of alcohol, drugs, or suicide, people find it even harder to know what to say. Would you agree? And I guess, how do you handle other people who may react badly or try to sidestep things about your grief?
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think that's absolutely right. And I think I expected some disquiet with all my memoirs because they all involve death. I mean, the death of each person was what prompted me to write the book. And I knew that talking honestly about some of Gill's difficulties, from the shoplifting to the alcoholism, that there would be people who think, this is, robbing her of her dignity, and to which I can only say, she didn't really have that dignity when she was in a bad state, and that I like to think she would understand the impulse to honesty that's there in the book. But yeah, there will be people who feel we shouldn't talk about this stuff. I remember going to Josie's funeral. She was only in her 40s. It was a self-destructive death. It was, in effect, a suicide, but I knew that word. I wondered whether that word would be used, or whether there'd be any gesture or acknowledgement in the funeral about the tragic manner of her death, and there wasn't, because I think it's too uncomfortable in that climate. But I think in a memoir, in a book, as long as you're not being malicious and vindictive or got any grievance that you're airing against the person who's died, and I don't think I did in any of my books, you should do it. I mean, there shouldn't be a taboo around death and talking honestly about it, or talking honestly about the aftermath of death and how it leaves people. Yeah. It's a really important part of our lives.
Yeah, and one that people hide away. We have a sort of related question from Jane. My daughter Amy died after battling with alcohol addiction all her adult life. There is a perception that those suffering with alcohol addiction make a choice to drink. This is exactly kind of what we were saying earlier, when of course the science tells us that addiction is a progressive disease which changes the structure of the brain. I wonder what you think about the lack of adequate and expert services to help those struggling with alcohol.
Well, I think it's bad. And I think, okay, the alcoholic, the addict is probably going to sort of shy away. Certainly my sister would have shied away from any intervention. She did do whenever there were opportunities. But nonetheless, more could have been done. More could have been done at an earlier stage. I'm not blaming any individuals in the family, but yeah, the wider services provided by our society were lacking. And there must be cases where they could have made a difference, where lives could have been saved. Because the importance of an early kind of intervention is crucial. That we know that the death rates for alcoholics are really, really bad. But we know if the problems are picked up early enough, there is some hope.
We've had just some really nice comments as well. Ross says, I love the poem that you read and the extracts read by Liesl. It seems quite difficult to find the book of poems. So I think Katrine was going to try to put that in the chat. Debbie comments, I think to speak honestly but respectfully about difficult deaths can be very validating for others going through something similar. And I really agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of doing it, isn't it? You're not just indulging yourself. You know there'll be other people out there who've gone through something similar, and you hope what you say will help them. They will maybe articulate something they've been feeling, but they haven't been able to put into words quite like that. Or they'll think, oh God, I'm not the only person in the world then who's gone through that. And there's a solace and comfort in knowing that.
I think we have time for just one more question. This is from Karen. Skin and Blister is a beautiful collection of poems that I think any sister would welcome. Did it help you to find any kind of closure in writing them? And is there anything else from your life you feel the need to write about? Is there more life writing for you? Are you planning to return to King's Lynn this year? I've got 2 new books for you to sign.
I would love to come to King's Lynn if I was invited, because I didn't have a proper event of my own there last year. But anyway, closure, no. I don't really believe in closure. I don't believe you ever. I mean, you can correct me and others can correct me, but I don't really believe you achieve that, or I don't. But you can understand more through creative practice, through therapy, through talking to people. You can find, if not closure, you can find the solace that comes from greater understanding. You can stop blaming yourself and be, if not at peace, be in a better place. And I think I am. I think with each of my books, I've been in a better place having written them than I was before I started out.
That's lovely. Well, I think that is the perfect place to finish our conversation. I see it's past, but it's been really, really lovely getting a chance to talk to you. I could talk to you a lot longer, Blake, about your poems and your work.
Well, thank you. We'll talk again sometime. And thanks to all for all the questions.
We will. And thanks to everybody in the audience. There's been some lovely chat coming through, and also to all your fantastic questions. So thank you very much, and bye for now.